The movie begins at the funeral of a teenage boy named Darren Shan. Everyone is devastated at his loss. In fact, he is seen inside the coffin, craving raw meat. One day, he also gets a very tempting urge to kill and suck his sister's blood. However, he ultimately refrains himself from his bloodlust and runs back to his room. There, he finds Larton sitting in the corner, reading his books. Larton warns Darren that he needs to leave his home as he is a threat to himself and his family. Darren doesn't want to do so, but after coming really close to harming his own sister, he decides to leave. However, he also doesn't want his parents to keep worrying about him forever, so he decides to fake his death. Later that night, on the rooftop of the house, Larton assists Darren in the act by breaking his neck. This will make everyone believe that he accidentally fell to his demise. The movie then cuts to the present. At Darren's funeral, all his friends, teachers, and family pay their respects, while Darren is alive and well, inside the coffin playing games on his phone. The same night, Larton digs up the grave and gets Darren out of the coffin. But before they can leave, Merlot arrives out of nowhere and ambushes them. Fortunately, Larton fights him off and manages to subdue him temporarily. Following the close call, he takes Darren to the freak show campgrounds, where they meet a girl named Rebecca. Meanwhile, Steve is grief-stricken by his friend's death. As a result, he distances himself from society and becomes a maniac. When the pain becomes unbearable, one day, he contemplates ending it all, but just as he is about to commit the unthinkable, Mr. Tiny arrives there and stops him. He mentions that he's aware of Steve's unfortunate life and his obsession with all things vampire. He then offers him a chance to become a vampanese. It turns out Tiny and Merlot are vampanese, and they are a different race of vampires who, unlike Larton and the others, murder humans to feed on their blood. It's also revealed that vampanese and the normal vampires are arch enemies, and they don't see eye to eye. As Steve hears everything in disbelief, Mr. Tiny discloses something even more shocking. He says that Darren is alive and happy in the other world, something which Steve had always dreamt of and aspired to. The revelation makes the latter angry, so without a second thought, he accepts the offer. Meanwhile, Darren slowly gets comfortable in the freak campground with the other freaks. He starts to train himself and helps others in their duties. One day, Darren goes through the pictures of his old life and decides to give Steve a call. But before he can do so, Larton arrives there, snatches the phone from Darren, and breaks it. That night, Mr. Tiny visits the freak camp to talk with Larton and Mr. Tall about Darren. It turns out the boy has special innate powers, so Mr. Tiny asks him to hand them over. Despite being enemies, a diplomatic Mr. Tall politely tells him that he will think about it. Afterwards, Larton instructs Darren not to leave the camp, as it is not safe for him anymore. He then begins to train Darren so that he can handle himself if he is ever in trouble. At first, the boy fails to lay a single hand on Larton, but as his training progresses, his skills and strength develop. On the other hand, Merlot turns Steve into a vampanese, which gives him unreal powers. The boy also becomes more evil, and his first victim turns out to be none other than his history teacher. "You gave me an F. F is for fangs." Meanwhile, as Darren begins to feel hungry, he starts craving for fresh blood. To remedy this, Larton takes him to a nearby farm and sedates a man. He says that vampires never kill people, they just borrow their blood. However, despite his hunger, Darren cannot bring himself to do it, so they return back to the camp. Shortly after, the freaks' peaceful campground is suddenly invaded by a group of ruthless vampanese. Chaos ensues as the two sides engage in a brutal fight, resulting in a lot of bloodshed. It becomes clear that the vampanese are searching for Darren, and soon enough, they find him hiding inside a costume room with Rebecca. The vampanese attack Darren and a fierce brawl breaks out, but fortunately, thanks to the timely arrival of Larton, Mr. Tall, and the other freaks, the fight is eventually broken off, and Darren is saved from certain doom. However, when the dust settles, it is revealed that Merlot has kidnapped Rebecca. The following morning, Darren sets off to find her, as he blames himself for the entire incident. In the meantime, Mr. Tiny kidnaps his family, hoping to lure him into a trap. After a while, Darren arrives at his home and finds it empty. He then notices a flyer on the table inviting him to the circus. Meanwhile, Larton also decides to join in on the fight, and so he gathers his weapons. In the next scene, Darren makes his way to the circus, where he finds Rebecca and his family tied and hung up on the wall. He is also perplexed to see Steve with the vampanese. Nevertheless, he attacks his former best friend without any hesitation, while Larton also arrives and starts tussling with Merlot. As Darren has not consumed any any blood, he becomes very weak and easily gets bruised as compared to Steve. But right then, Rebecca frees herself and orders Darren to drink her blood so that he can get his energy back. Initially, he refuses to comply, but when Rebecca assures him that she will be fine, he sucks her blood. Elsewhere, Larton ends up being wounded very badly, but despite this, he uses the last of his strength and stabs Merlot right in his heart, killing him. Immediately afterwards, Darren starts to fight with Steve again, while Mr. Tiny watches from a distance. Having had enough, he decides to intervene and stop them. Mr. Tiny resuscitates Merlot using his special powers by turning him into a dwarf creature. He then asks the two boys to come with him. Amazed by his power, Steve immediately obliges, but Darren does not. In the aftermath of the showdown, Larton hypnotizes Darren's family so that their recent memory is wiped. This way, they won't remember the supernatural events that took place right in front of their eyes. The movie ends as Darren returns back to the camp, where all of the freaks welcome him warmly and make him feel home.